All right, so in this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the declining Eurasian empires. And here we're going to talk about the collapse of the Qing Dynasty. So if we think about where we were the last time we were talking about China, so if we think about China in time period 4, they were still like the Ottoman Empire. They were still rich and powerful. They still conducted a lot of trade, and they were able to restrict European access to Chinese trade markets. So remember that they kept the British and the Portuguese restricted to one particular port. Also remember that China really only wanted silver. They weren't interested in European trade goods. They had everything that they wanted made in China. So the only thing that the Europeans had to offer was silver. Now, as we move into time period 5, things are going to change a little. We'll talk more about this in a different video, but the British took over India by the 1750s. And as they took over India, they also cultivated opium poppies in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is just north of India, so kind of northern India at this time, but today we would call this area Afghanistan. Now, opium poppies have been part of human society for thousands of years. They produce a natural painkiller that has been used as medicine for thousands of years. Now, if you refine the seeds of the opium poppies, you can create what is essentially heroin. And so what the British did is the British introduced opium to China, basically creating opium addicts to force China to trade with them. Now, this was all done illegally. This was illegally smuggled into the country. And the Chinese asked politely if the British would stop. But the British didn't. So here's how they made this work for them. They would meet smugglers off the coast and sell them the opium for silver. And then the British would take the silver and buy Chinese trade goods with it. So the British are buying Chinese trade goods with their own silver. And then Chinese smugglers sell the opium for more silver, and the process continues. Now, eventually, the Chinese have had enough of this because it is illegal. All of this is illegal. And eventually, there are too many opium addicts, and the Chinese have had enough. So eventually, by 1839, the Chinese had enough, and they throw a confiscated shipment of opium into the ocean. And we all know how well the British respond to having their trade goods thrown into the ocean. And this starts the Opium War, which lasts from 1839 to 1842. The war does not last very long. The British Navy is too strong for China, is too strong for the Chinese Navy. And the war really ends when the British sail gunboats into the Grand Canal and threaten to blow it up. And they do this in 1842. And it's at that point the Chinese surrender. And they sign what's known as an Unequal Treaty. And it's called an Unequal Treaty because the Chinese don't get anything out of it. So what the Unequal Treaty does is it gives the British full access to several ports, it legalizes the opium trade. It allowed Christian missionaries and no tariffs on European trade goods. And this pretty much opened the floodgate for other Europeans. So by 1900, 90 ports in China were controlled by Europeans and Americans and the Japanese, who we will deal with in a separate video. So, what the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese, what the industrialized powers do, they create what are called spheres of influence. And what a sphere of influence is a form of economic imperialism. So what does that mean? They're not governing. So this isn't a political thing. Spheres of influence are a way of extracting wealth from, in this case, China, but you could do this anywhere. It's just being done in China. So it's a way of extracting wealth. They don't care about the government. They're not trying to impose their culture or their language on China. All they want to do is extract wealth. They just want the money. Now, this was particularly humiliating for the Chinese, who always viewed themselves as the superior people. So this was really humiliating for China. And really, the period from about 1850 to about 1950 is a century of humiliation for China. And they're really only starting to recover from it within the past few decades. Now, on top of all of this stuff, China also starts to suffer from inefficient agriculture. Remember, the rest of the world is growing more than enough food for its population, but China never really came up with better farming techniques. So while the population in the 19th century goes up, the food production stays pretty stagnant. It doesn't really move. And this leads to famines and rebellions. So if we take this stuff and connect it to this stuff, it's pretty easy to see why there would be a lot of peasant rebellions. People are upset about the European involvement in the economy, and there's not enough food to eat. So it seems pretty easy to see why the people would be upset with the Qing government. And the biggest, most devastating rebellion in China during the 19th century was the Taiping Rebellion. Which lasts from 1850 to 1864. And the point of the Taiping Rebellion was to topple the Qing government and make things more fair for the poor people. And so there is kind of an idea of socialism inherent within the Taiping Rebellion. They also wanted to abolish foot binding, and promote education, and they also wanted to promote gender equality. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was eventually squashed, but it wasn't squashed by the Qing government. They failed. It was squashed by the Qing Dynasty and their European and American allies. The industrial powers supported the Qing Dynasty because they could control it. And so they wanted to protect it from the Taiping Rebellion. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was 14 years long. It was a long rebellion, and it was exceedingly devastating. Over the course of the Taiping Rebellion, 20 to 30 million people died through violence or famine or disease. So about as many people died in the Taiping Rebellion as died during the Black Death. So this was just as devastating to China as it was, or as the Black Death was. And this caused a lot of migration to the United States. So in the midst of the rebellion, this is when a lot of Chinese people left China and came to the United States looking for work or food, either bringing their family or sending money back home to China. Now, just like every place else we've looked at that was declining during this time period, it was apparent to the leaders of China that they needed to reform, that they were falling behind. And so they do attempt to reform, but especially in China, these reforms come way too late. So there were a few attempts to try to reconcile Confucianism with Western ideas and industrialization. So, a couple of examples of this. There was this idea called the self-strengthening movement. Which tried to use Western technology to industrialize, but most of the money was either stolen or misused, and it really didn't work out so well. But they did try to kind of reconcile Confucianism with these Western ideas. The other problem with reconciling Confucianism with Western ideas is that there were still strong conservative voices in China that resisted change. So in the late 1890s, Emperor Guangxu attempted a set of radical political and economic reforms. The same kinds of reforms that we've been seeing in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. The problem was he was opposed by the wife of the former emperor. I believe this was his aunt. And she was known as Empress Cixi. She was the main conservative voice. So she was really conservative. And Guangxu was liberal. He wanted to open things up and try to figure out a way to move China forward. she had the emperor arrested and appointed a new emperor who would follow her. All of these different threads come together in the early 1900s. Cixi organized an anti-foreigner secret society. And it was called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. The Europeans called these guys boxers, because of the fists. And in 1900, the boxers led a rebellion against all foreigners. And all of the industrialized powers united against the boxers. And to put this into perspective, every major combatant in World War I teams up against China. So both sides of World War I, the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, all of them are going to fight against China. And China is going to get blown out of the water. This pretty much marks the end of the Qing Dynasty. The Chinese lost all support for the Qing. And when Cixi died in 1908, the new emperor was a child, and he was pretty easily deposed. And so in 1911, China becomes a republic. With no emperor. Now, this little kid doesn't die, and he's going to have a long, rich life on his own, which we probably won't have time to go into, but he's going to still be around, and he's still going to influence things. But at this point, he's out of the Chinese picture, and China becomes a republic, and we'll pick the story up in China right at the beginning of World War I. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.